I cannot say enough good things about the Daniel de Granu class on poker and now 10-time world champion Phil Ivey's courses on Texas Hold'em that I've watched and rewatched on Masterclass's platform. Both Ivey and Negranu's classes have helped me establish sound fundamentals and even some advanced technique in my Texas Hold'em game. Those are only two of scores of courses available on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself professionally or in your hobbies and support the show by using the link in the show notes. Now, to our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
Both Winston Churchill and Jan Smuts, years after the Second Boer War, described the Jameson Raid as the real declaration of war. Though this failed raid occurred nearly 4 years before the Second Boer War. Maybe that is hyperbole. Here is what historian Ian Smith writes about the aftermath of the failed Jameson Raid. Quote, after the Jameson Raid and the abortive Uitlander uprising, relations between the Transvaal Republic and the British government could never be the same again. These events therefore helped to set South Africa on the course which led to the war in October 1899. The British and Boer populations throughout South Africa were polarized by what had occurred. The worst suspicions of many Afrikaners were confirmed, and those outside the Transvaal felt a surge of sympathy towards their threatened kinsfolk within it. A powerful charge was given to the development of Afrikaner nationalism and republicanism throughout the region. Most of those Cape Afrikaners who had supported Rhodes felt bitterly betrayed. As one of their most eloquent spokesmen declared, Rhodes had acted as a sort of dividing wall between colonial Afrikaners and their brothers in the republics. His dagger thrust had sent an electric shock to the heart of Afrikanerdom and aroused in it a new nationalist awareness and solidarity fired by the threat of British dominance and imperialism. The alliance which Rhodes had constructed with Hofmeier's Afrikaner Bond was shattered. Henceforth, white politics in South Africa divided on ethnic lines. End quote. Lest you think Smith's words are just the product of cold, calculated hindsight, listen to what the editor of the One Land newspaper wrote after the Jameson Raid. F.S. Melan wrote, quote, the dagger thrust used in an attempt to paralyze Afrikanerdom forever in the republics sent an electric shock through the national heart. Afrikanerdom awakened with all earnestness and consciousness. A new wave of feeling infused the entire South Africa. End quote. Somewhat ironically, the Jameson Raid saved the Kruger administration because Transvaalers stood behind Kruger increasingly, and the Orange Free State grew closer to their sister republic. What could be even more ironic? This growing support of Kruger likely helped bring the Transvaal's independence to an end.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
But the grievances, both legitimate and fictitious, of the Uitlanders and of mining houses didn't disappear after the Jameson Raid. Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain would no longer view these grievances as fictitious to a great extent, like previous secretaries. Chamberlain saw Uitlanders as the way to achieve peaceful revolution at the Transvaal ballot box. This view of the Uitlander potential to turn the Transvaal friendly only cemented after the Jameson Raid. The Transvaal Republic's violations of the 1884 London Convention and Uitlander grievances served as two of the best cards the British thought they had to play in getting South Africa federated on British-friendly terms. Had Rhodes and Jameson not fallen on the sword and accepted full responsibility for the Jameson Raid, Chamberlain may have had to resign. Had Chamberlain had to resign, a less confrontational colonial secretary may have taken his place. Had a less confrontational colonial secretary taken Chamberlain's place, British and Transvaal relations could have taken a very different course. But Chamberlain did not resign. Kruger's government prepared for war after 1896, knowing that they could never trust the British government. Kruger's government grew steadfast in their belief that they could never trust Uitlanders to be loyal, and thus could not give Uitlanders the vote. How convenient. Many Uitlanders made common cause with the British during the First Boer War, and then again during the Jameson Raid. Smith writes that the Uitlanders, quote, had now revealed themselves to be a potential Trojan horse within the country in league with the Transvaal's enemies without, end quote. Kruger's progressive opposition in the Volksraad had sought to address Uitlander grievances and clean up corruption in the Transvaal government before the raid. But after the Jameson Raid, to be a more progressive member of the Transvaal's Volksraad meant you were dooming yourself to further political marginalization. Kruger's government's approach to the Uitlanders gained more credibility as more Transvaalers united behind his stubborn resistance to British intervention. Then, another republic linked arms with the Transvaal. The Orange Free State sent a commando to the Fall River border during the Jameson Raid. Though the Orange Free State had and still did want a customs union to lower tariffs within South Africa, the new president took management of Orange Free State railways out of the Cape Colony's hands and planned to cooperate instead with the Netherlands Railway Company if war broke out in South Africa. In March 1897, the two Boer republics renewed a treaty of mutual support and defense in case one of them was attacked. The two Boer republics agreed to an offensive alliance that Kruger had tried and failed to secure 10 years earlier from Jan Brandt. The opposition party in the Free State opposed this offensive treaty because they feared being obligated to attack on behalf of their extremely corrupt and anti-British neighbor. The two republics also added a new clause to the treaty, proclaiming the desire to have a federal union between each other. After securing this March 1897 agreement, Kruger celebrated with a glass of champagne. This was the only time he drank alcohol in his life. So, who was this new president of the Orange Free State? We'll say Free State from now on. Who was this new president that was embracing stronger ties between the Boer republics? In 1857, Martinus Tunis Steyn became the first Free State president born in the Free State. Martinus's father's farm sat just outside Bloemfontein. Martinus and his family associated mainly with English elite in the Free State capital of Bloemfontein. Martinus went to study law in the Netherlands, but transferred to London to study law because his Dutch was much worse than his English. Martinus served as a judge in Bloemfontein beginning in 1889 at age 32. Then, Martinus won election for president of the Free State with more than 80% of the vote in 1896, before he had even turned 40. He sought to make the Free State more democratic and to encourage greater use of Dutch in all spheres of Free State life. But in no surprise to many of you, the Free State owed much of its identity to events decades prior to Steyn's presidency. Some of you may remember from episode 5 that the Orange Free State had been willing in the late 1850s to join a federation with the Cape Colony and Natal. But the Derby cabinet at the time decided that federation would be too expensive for the British government. Then about 10 years later, a British arbiter put the screws to the Free State and the Transvaal by awarding diamond territory discovered between they and the Cape Colony to the Huiqua and the Barolong tribes. The Keat Award of 1871 formed Huiqua Land West, the land of these tribes, and the Diamond Territory. Then the British quickly annexed this new territory. Jan Brandt, president of the Free State at the time, did manage to wrangle 90,000 pounds of compensation afterwards from the British. Brandt then set up a bank with those funds to make the Free State's finances more independent. Brandt served as president of the Free State from 1864 to 1888, and during those 24 years helped build a strong, fair legal system devoid of corruption associated with the Transvaal in order to attract investment and trade. Historian Herman Guillemijn continues the Free State story, writing, quote, "This small republic was ambitious and wanted to attract immigrants with good qualifications. A Scot, John Brebner, reformed the education system, and in Bloemfontein, CLF Borkenhagen, a German, became editor of De Express in 1877. An avid proponent of Republican independence, Borkenhagen exercised a significant influence on both sides of the Fall River. By 1890, the Free State was regarded as the part of South Africa which had the most efficient administration. James Bryce, a British constitutional commentator, labeled it a model republic. The rural character, relatively homogeneous voter body, and the absence of concentrations of wealth made this republic a stable one. English speakers and a few Germans dominated the trade and professional life in the towns. The state welcomed immigrants, and its republicanism was linked to a nationhood which included all white people." End quote. Think of how different this Free State was from its sister republic across the Fall River. The Transvaal government had developed a reputation for its corruption going back decades. Kruger heightened this reputation in how his administration granted monopolies to cronies. Plus, mining companies felt they had to bribe officials to get even the smallest market reforms through. Kruger's administration brought in many New Hollanders to the government and civil service, so the Transvaal had a much stronger Dutch influence in some ways. Kruger's administration had stepped up hostility towards immigrants, towards Uitlanders. The Free State still remained largely English-speaking, but also a republic whose people were fiercely loyal to it, not to England or any other state. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind the mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. Another nation voiced support for the Transvaal in the aftermath of the Jameson Raid. Kruger received a now famous telegram on January 3, 1896, after squashing the Jameson Raid. The telegram congratulated Kruger for his success in stopping the raid. Quote, "Without calling on the aid of friendly powers, in re-establishing peace and defending the independence of the country against attacks from without." End quote. This telegram contained at least 2 intentionally provocative innuendos calculated to anger the British government. When the telegram referred to an independent Transvaal, this ignored the limits to the 1884 London Convention placed on the Transvaal and implied that British suzerainty had lapsed when the Pretoria Convention had been superseded by the London Convention. The telegram referred to Germany when it spoke of the aid of friendly powers. The Times published this telegram in London on January 4th, thus inflaming anti-German feeling in Britain and diverting attention away from the Jameson Raid. Queen Victoria told her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the author of the telegram, quote, "It is considered very unfriendly towards this country," end quote. The German diplomat to Britain at the time, Paul von Hatzfeldt-Wildenberg, wrote that if the British government had declared war on Germany in that first week of January, the British people would have supported the war. Imagine that, an Anglo-German war breaking out in 1896. I should note, though, that Otto von Bismarck appointed this diplomat, Hatzfeldt. You'll hear why this matters momentarily. Had Kaiser Wilhelm II been as able a statesman as Otto von Bismarck, or even had the wisdom of his father, Kaiser Wilhelm I, son Wilhelm may never have sent his January 3rd telegram congratulating Krieger. Historian Norman Rich stated that the fundamental reason that Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck, the longtime German chancellor, was because Bismarck had begun attempting to push through constitutional reforms that would curb the authority of the Kaiser position. Kaiser means emperor in English. After dismissing Otto von Bismarck in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II had neither the wisdom nor statesmanship of either predecessor, and so was in a position to send the congratulatory telegram to Krieger in 1896, unwittingly helping alleviate pressure on Chamberlain and other British implicated in the Jameson Raid. This was the same Kaiser Wilhelm II who led Germany into a naval arms race with the British, and yes, eventually into World War I. In 1899, this same Kaiser encouraged German Uitlanders to be loyal to the Transvaal, and encouraged a father-son-like relationship between Germany and the Transvaal. We already heard last episode about Germany forcefully opposing British involvement in the sale of Delagoa Bay. The British hadn't forgotten this, or been blind to the heavy German capital behind the Netherlands Railway Company. The German Foreign Minister's diary even reveals on January 3rd, the day after the Jameson Raiders were rounded up, that the Kaiser wanted to land troops in the Transvaal, but that the Kaiser was ultimately dissuaded from doing so for fear that landing troops would lead to war with England. All that said, German support for the Transvaal ultimately proved to be very temperamental. Smith writes, quote, "The dispatch of the telegram was more a product of the posturing of the impetuous Kaiser. The long-term aim of the German government at this time was to obstruct Britain in the colonial area and elsewhere, as a means of challenging her splendid isolation from the two continental European blocs and attracting her into the orbit of the Triple Alliance. The German government would never jeopardize its relations with Britain over the Transvaal and had no real intention of seeking to establish any sort of German protectorate over Krieger's republic or of encouraging it into a confrontation with Britain." End quote. Trying to attract the British into what became the Triple Alliance was not crazy. The Salisbury cabinet and those before it seriously considered making alliances with members of the Triple Alliance. Now, Krieger didn't even seriously trust Germany as an ally and sought to get more guarantees of imperial assistance from Germany and other possible European allies before doing anything that would give the British an excuse to tighten the noose around the Transvaal. So would Germany or other enemies of the British have the Boers back in the Second Boer War? Some of you know. Some of you will have to wait and hear. With no one willing yet to be a true ally to the Transvaal, Krieger tried to renegotiate the London Convention of 1884 unilaterally with the British. Article 4 came up the most. We discussed Article 4 in episode 15, but it bears rereading. Quote, "The South African Republic will conclude no treaty or engagement with any state or nation other than the Orange Free State, nor with any native tribe to the eastward or westward of the Republic, until the same has been approved by Her Majesty the Queen. Such approval shall be considered to have been granted if Her Majesty's government shall not, within 6 months after receiving a copy of such treaty, which shall be delivered to them immediately upon its completion, have notified that the conclusion of such treaty is in conflict with the interest of Great Britain or of any of Her Majesty's possessions in South Africa." End quote. Kruger fixated on full independence for the Transvaal Republic, compensation for the Jameson Raid, and guarantees against any future aggression by the British. All this was to no avail for Kruger. He and Chamberlain would continue to keep their own very different, very expedient interpretations of the London Convention, making it impossible to renegotiate. Chamberlain privately insisted that no compromise could be reached with the Kruger government. Quote, "Unless the President will frankly recognize the superior interests of the paramount power in the welfare of South Africa." End quote. Kruger and Chamberlain fought over what should be done about the Uitlander population, especially those in the Rand, in the Transvaal's gold mining district. This further emboldened Uitlanders to protest for the vote and greater political power in the Transvaal. Chamberlain proposed giving the Rand local autonomy, local governance, that ostensibly wouldn't threaten war governance of the rest of the country. Kruger's government didn't embrace this idea either. Nor did Kruger agree to another conference in London for the spring of 1896 because of an inability for both sides to agree on what was up for renegotiation. Chamberlain didn't give Kruger any optimism when he praised Rhodes for great services rendered and denounced Kruger in a speech in the British House of Commons. That spring of 1896 saw some British MPs and some influential British press members that included the Times and others fed by pro-Rhodes newspapers in South Africa, call for British troops to be sent to South Africa since Kruger was rearming the Transvaal. Chamberlain suggested to Sir Hercules Robinson that troops be sent to ostensibly help suppress the Ndebele rebellion in Rhodesia when those troops were really meant for the Transvaal. But Robinson saw this as too transparent an act that could unite Boers across South Africa against the British. And the British cabinet had just committed to reconquering the Sudan. So sending troops to Rhodesia to get the Transvaal in line never happened. Sir Hercules Robinson urged Chamberlain to wait for a better opportunity to deal with the Transvaal. The Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, Sir Gordon Sprigg, said plainly, quote, "This is not the time for an ultimatum and troops. The resources of diplomacy are not yet exhausted." End quote. President Steyn of the Free State said he was doing his best to encourage cooperation among South African states after the Jameson Raid, but warned, quote, "We must live together, do what we like. A war would only make the breach wider and would make it still more difficult for Dutch and English to live together. No one here thinks of such a thing. If imperial interference can be prevented, and if the imperial government will only exercise patience and not push matters, things in the Transvaal will come right. Neither the Transvaal nor the Free State wishes for war, because we know what it means. But should it be forced on us then, of course, we will fight." End quote. Chamberlain didn't voice frustration as much at Steyn's remarks as he did privately complain about Sir Hercules Robinson and other colonial office advisors like Edward Fairfield he inherited from the previous government. These advisors struck him as Gladstonian liberals. In A Statement of Policy in 1896, Chamberlain reflected on what he and the Gladstone cabinet's thinking was in 1881 as they engineered the Pretoria Convention of 1881. Chamberlain wrote, quote, "We all believed that the Transvaal was absolutely in our hands. We were influenced by moral considerations, i.e., we thought the Boers had been badly treated and were true patriots, that we were bound as a great and powerful Christian nation to be magnanimous, etc. It was really a chivalrous piece of business, and it certainly has not brought any reward in this world. The Boers believe that we gave way because we were afraid of them, and the Boers have been intolerable ever since." End quote. Chamberlain had to wait. He had to wait not only for the right opportunity to get the Boers in line, but also to get advisors he wanted into key positions in the first place, like Sir Hercules Robinson's British High Commissioner for South Africa position. Chamberlain's intelligence reports estimated that the Transvaal contained 25,000 Boers and 50,000 Uitlanders, with almost 40,000 of those Uitlanders being British. These are the inaccurate estimates that the British stuck with until the South African War, the Second Boer War, began. Believing Uitlanders made up the majority of the Transvaal and produced 90% of its wealth, the British thought the best way to bring the Transvaal completely into dominion without war was to find a way to get the vote for Uitlanders. However, Chamberlain held a low view of Uitlanders as a money-hungry lot too disunited to push for real political clout. The South African League started to change this, especially in the Cape Colony, where they tried to get more progressive, pro-British officials elected. Cape Uitlanders in the South African League openly proclaimed wanting South Africa to be united under a British flag. The South African League was pretty self-driven, and sometimes had to have their demands tempered by the British. For example, British agent in Pretoria, Pakenham Green, had to urge SAL representatives in the Transvaal not to hold public meetings in the Transvaal to demonstrate against Krieger's administration. Both in 1897 and 1898, Green warned the SAL that these ploys to get British intervention in the Transvaal would only complicate matters. However, Chamberlain looked for any plausible way to interpret legislation passed in the Transvaal as violations of the London Convention. That way he could find excuses for British intervention in that Boer Republic. The Alien Expulsion Bill surfaced around the time of the Jameson Raid. The bill would have granted the authority to kick out any immigrant the President and Executive Council deemed a danger to the public peace and order. Then, the Alien Immigration Act of January 1897 aimed to slow the immigration of undesirable foreigners and make existing foreigners in the Transvaal register. Smith writes, quote, "All prospective immigrants had to prove their ability to support themselves financially, and all resident aliens had to register and renew their passports each year. These laws gave Krieger no powers not already possessed in Britain by the Home Secretary." End quote. The Uitlanders resented these laws, and Chamberlain, of course, claimed these violated Article 4 of the London Convention. The Transvaal Volksraad also passed a press law permitting the government to shut down any publication that was in conflict with public morals or dangerous to the order and peace of the Republic. This press law was passed in response to English-language publications circulating articles and cartoons that criticized or even mocked President Krieger. Chamberlain demanded the immediate repeal of the immigration law and sought to build up British forces in South Africa again in that year of 1897. Chamberlain repeated his demands in dispatches to the Transvaal in April of 1897, but this time the British cabinet authorized a naval show of force off of Delagoa Bay to make Krieger back down and to ward off the Germans from meddling in these Anglo-Boer disputes. The British cabinet also agreed to quietly send 1,500 more British reinforcements to South Africa, bringing the total British force in South Africa to about 8,000. When Green delivered Chamberlain's dispatches and news of the naval demonstration to Krieger on April 15th, Krieger reportedly exclaimed that Green was holding a knife to Krieger's throat. Then Chamberlain told Green 11 days later to let Krieger know that the British had been tracking the Transvaal's rearmament and had increased British forces in South Africa for purely defensive purposes. This British brinksmanship paid off in May. The Volksraad, per Krieger's request, repealed the alien immigration law in May, and then revised the alien expulsion law in accordance with British objections in July. British intelligence relayed to Chamberlain that Kruger told the Volksraad in a secret session that he didn't think it was wise to provoke war. Chamberlain's handling of this crisis of April 1897 won him more credibility in cabinet and emboldened him to continue dealing firmly with Kruger in the future. The illness and retirement of 4 men also worked in Chamberlain's favor. I won't bother you with the names of 3 of them, but know they were British officials involved with South African policy, all of whom tried to restrain or curb Chamberlain's aggressive impulses. One of those retirees was British High Commissioner in South Africa, Sir Hercules Robinson. It wasn't long before someone else, who didn't seek to restrain Chamberlain's confrontational methods, sailed to South Africa to take Robinson's place. Rather than restrain Chamberlain, this bureaucrat would arguably go farther than Chamberlain to provoke the Transvaal. Many historians assumed that Cecil Rhodes was influenced by a particular professor at Oxford. The whole university would crowd in to hear this professor preach a gospel of beauty and public service to an age wearied of ugliness and commercial self-interest. This professor's first ever lecture in 1870 to Oxford students captivated many young men of Oxford. The professor said that Great Britain had, quote, the firmness to govern and the grace to obey. Will you, youths of England, make your country again a royal throne of kings, a sceptred isle, for all the world a source of light, a center of peace, mistress of learning and of the arts, faithful guardian of great memories in the midst of irreverent and ephemeral visions, a faithful servant of time-tried principles? This is what England must either do or perish. She must found colonies as fast and as far as she is able, seizing every piece of fruitful waste ground she can set her foot on, and there teaching these her colonists that their first aim is to be to advance the power of England by land and sea. All that I ask of you is to have a fixed purpose of some kind for your country and yourselves, no matter how restricted, so that it be fixed and unselfish." End quote. After this speech, the professor would lead a huge flock of young Oxford students to swampy ground above Oxford University. With picks and shovels, they tried to construct a road to Hinksey. They worked on the road for 2 months, but the road eventually became an abandoned, incomplete, crooked path of bumps. Professor John Ruskin spoke this inaugural address and worked alongside students on the Hinksey Road years before Rhodes arrived at Oxford, and it is argued by some historians that there is no evidence that Rhodes was ever influenced by Ruskin. One of the young men shoveling the eventually aborted road to Hinksey definitely took Ruskin's message to heart. The student won many awards at Oxford. He practiced law, then worked as a journalist for the Pall Mall Gazette. The former student ran for Parliament as a Liberal candidate in 1885, but was defeated. He then worked as a private secretary for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then served with distinction as an administrator in Egypt after the British occupied Egypt, and then wrote a book in 1892 titled England and Egypt. From 1892 to 1897, this Ruskin disciple served as chairman of the Board of Inland Revenue in Egypt as part of the British effort to make Egypt's internal finances more solvent. He was knighted during that tenure. He received bipartisan acclaim from British political leaders. Then, at age 43 in May 1897, Alfred Milner arrived in South Africa to take the place of Sir Hercules Robinson, to take the position of British High Commissioner of South Africa and Governor of the Cape Colony. Alfred Milner, a self-described British race patriot, said the following, quote, "From my point of view, this is fundamental. It is the British race which built the empire, and it is the undivided British race which can alone uphold it. Not that I underestimate the importance of the community of material interests in binding the different parts of the empire together, but deeper, stronger, more primordial than those material ties, is the bond of common blood, a common language, common history, and traditions." End quote. Like Joseph Chamberlain, and somewhat like Cecil Rhodes to an extent, the British Empire came first to Milner's thinking. He declared he wanted to give his best years to serving the imperial interests of the empire. Milner worked with a resolve towards a British-friendly South African Union. Milner thought British policy on South Africa had been vacillating and often weak. Pakenham writes, quote, "To Milner, the talk of avenging Machuba seemed distastefully crude. The battle itself was a conventional enough disaster, a poor tactical position, a diminutive force, a half-baked general. It was the whole annexation that had been hopelessly bungled. Frere had fumbled. Westminster had undermined him. The Treasury had ensured his failure. As for Gladstone's settlement, Milner could only wince at the thought." End quote. Soon after he arrived, Milner pushed for British troop numbers on the ground to increase from 5,400 to 10,000. Chamberlain only wrangled enough from the House of Commons to get troop numbers up to 8,000. Why did Milner want a stronger British force? Some argue that Milner, from the beginning, wanted to start a war with the Transvaal to assert British dominance in South Africa. Ian Smith argues that the historical evidence does not support this assertion. He argues that Milner wanted these troop numbers so that he could back up the policy demands he made on the Boers. Milner and Chamberlain didn't want war from the beginning, but were not willing to have peace at any price. Both knew that sending more British troops to South Africa would cause a commotion among the Boers, but both believed this had to be done in the face of increased defense spending by the Kruger administration. Kruger's administration did give more local autonomy to Johannesburg, grant the vote to some loyal Uitlanders, and make some other minor reforms in the aftermath of the Jameson Raid to appease the British and some Uitlanders. Milner spent 1897 doing heavy traveling and assessing of South Africa's situation, and tried to avoid any unnecessary irritating of the Kruger government after the April crisis of 1897 was resolved. So South Africa finished the year of 1897 in relative calm. Now we will shift our focus briefly again to the Transvaal, to the right-hand man you learned about in episode 14, Jan Smuts. We left Jan in June of 1898 after he became the Transvaal government's state attorney. Sometime in the middle of that 1897, though, Smuts wrote over 30 pages on the British position in South Africa, where he asked, quote, "Is England going to revert from the traditions of her greatest colonial statesmen? And is she trying now to reintroduce into South Africa that element of material force which has been gradually receding from her colonial empire?" At a time when the ties binding the British Empire together are not those of material force, but the ties of a community of ideas and sympathies. End quote. As Smuts watched the British increase its military strength in South Africa, he thought, quote, "When I saw how Chamberlain, in those leading questions and that spirit of partisan animosity which have been deeply pondered by every thinking man in South Africa, continually referred to the maintenance of England's rights in South Africa, even by force, I thought of the same phrase as it was bandied about the floor of the House of Parliament in the years immediately preceding the war with the American colonies." End quote. Smuts argued that existing Afrikaner loyalty to the British in South Africa was based on the belief that British rule was fair and just and a force for good. If this belief decayed too much because of the actions of Chamberlain, Smuts believed all of South Africa would eventually be involved in a war. Smuts took issue with Chamberlain's handling of South African affairs before Milner arrived on the scene. But Smuts would condemn the policy of both Chamberlain and Milner in the years and even decades ahead. Smuts, as you'll later see, became an apologist for the British Empire later in his long political career. But to the end of his long life, Smuts saw British management of South African affairs from 1895 to 1905 as a betrayal of all that was best in Britain's 19th century tradition of liberal empire. As legal advisor to the Executive Council, the Volksraad, and all Transvaal government departments, he shouldered the responsibility of writing almost all new legislation. Smuts did his best as the Transvaal state attorney to clean up the Transvaal government and remove any possible causes of war between the Transvaal and the British Empire. Smuts fought bribery and corruption within the police, as well as racketeering in liquor sales and prostitution. President Kruger, on the other hand, continued to keep plenty of enemies within the Transvaal. Kruger clashed with J.G. Kotze, the Chief Justice of the Transvaal Court, over the testing right of the judiciary, among other issues. The Chief Justice of the Cape Colony, Sir Henry de Villiers, acted as a mediator in this case, granting Kruger a conditional victory. However, Villiers took the opportunity, while interacting with Kruger in this case, to urge Kruger to do something about the grievances of other sections of the Transvaal population, especially the Uitlanders. That way Uitlanders would become friends, not enemies of the Transvaal. Villiers said, quote, "If redress is not granted, the danger will always exist that it may be sought elsewhere." End quote. Kruger stated that the Uitlanders would never be satisfied, but that he was working to deal with grievances of the gold mining industry. But Kruger kept plenty of enemies in the gold mining industry too. Though his Executive Council did set up an industrial commission of inquiry into the mining industry in March 1897, Kruger changed very little in response to the commission's findings. The dynamite concession, and the highest in all of South African railway rates, charged by the Netherlands Railway Company, really cut into mining houses' profits. But Kruger refused to eliminate or substantially reform idiotically inefficient monopolies in the Transvaal. Some of the mining magnates who could no longer stand Kruger were those who had stood with the Kruger administration while other magnates joined the Jameson Raid's plot. For example, J.B. Robinson, mining magnate and owner of the Johannesburg Times and Pretoria Press, sought to initiate a campaign to defeat Kruger and Krugerism. It wasn't just English mine owners and policymakers who turned against Kruger in growing numbers. German investors, German policymakers, and American investors started to turn against Kruger as well, because Kruger stood in the way of reforms that could help the mining industry. The same Piet Joubert, who led victorious Boer forces as Commandant General in the First Boer War, led more progressive opposition to Kruger in the Volksraad. Joubert challenged Kruger in all 4 of his presidential elections, and narrowly lost to Kruger in the 1893 election. Joubert's progressive faction criticized Kruger's administration for its corruption, its granting of inefficient monopolies, its appointing of advisors from the Netherlands, and its unwillingness to liberally seduce Uitlanders into becoming Transvaal patriots. With all this opposition to Kruger within the Transvaal, Alfred Milner for some months urged Chamberlain to avoid intervening in Transvaal affairs with hopes that the Kruger administration would self-destruct. But Chamberlain eventually sent a dispatch to the Transvaal in response to the Transvaal's request for foreign arbitration for disagreements between the Transvaal and the British. Chamberlain reasserted suzerainty, that ambiguous and oft-debated term we discussed back in episode 15. Many British officials before had written that the London Convention of 1884 got rid of suzerainty when it came to the Transvaal. Chamberlain joined a new wave of politicians who claimed the opposite, that the British still had suzerainty over the Transvaal because the Pretoria Convention's preamble hadn't been revoked. Most people involved knew these were bogus arguments made to justify further British involvement in the Transvaal's internal affairs. But then 1898 happened. The Venda people became some of the last people to fall to colonial expansion, to Boer expansion. The Transvaal sent 4,000 soldiers armed with new Mauser rifles and modern artillery into Chief Mfefu's land. After crushing the chief's forces, the Transvaal incorporated his former land of the Venda into the Transvaal. Many Venda fled to the nearby territory of Rhodesia. More importantly, in 1898, Skulk Burger, with considerable support from the mining industry, ran against Kruger on a platform of modest reform. Burger wanted the mining industry's grievances addressed, the judiciary to be independent, and the vote to be extended modestly. The mining industry attempted to pay Pete Joubert to withdraw from this 1898 election, but failed. The whole effort to replace Kruger failed. Kruger beat Skulk Burger by a scale of almost 4-1. Even if you counted votes for Joubert, Kruger demolished his combined opposition by a 2-1 margin. This giant margin shocked everyone. Then, W.P. Schreiner and his South African party won election in the Cape Colony's parliament. Schreiner was not a member of the Afrikaner Bond Party, but sought to have friendship with both the British Empire and all the neighboring South African states, including the Boer republics. The only group Schreiner and company were hostile to, Mr. Rhodes and his chartered clique. The hope for events naturally flowing in Milner and Chamberlain's favor was lost.